Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Harry. Oh my goodness, what a surprise. A little bit of egg on my face, do you think? Last week's podcast, Clive Irvin, Harry's going to fight to the bitter end. Golly, lots to talk about. No, there's no eggs on the bar, though, today to put on my face. Just lots of booze. It's the 24th, I think. Yes, it is. It's Friday. I'm recording this, the 24th of Jan. It's Burns night. I'm very excited. Big family gathering tonight, hence all the booze. And yes, mother-in-law Jennifer will be here, going around in her wheelchair. She's now walking up and down the steps by herself. Thank you to all of you who have been asking about her welfare. For those who don't know, my sort of neighbour / mother-in-law / close friend, Jennifer, has had an accident and she's been slowly recovering over Christmas and the New Year, but is definitely making progress, which is all good. And yes, and tonight we feast. It's not actually Burns night, as I'm sure many of you will know. That's actually Saturday, but because of the people we wanted to gather together, we're having it a day early. Burns Night Eve, the best night of the year. So yeah, Harry, golly. Well, yeah, and Clive's show. Thank you for watching. I think it's well over 5,000 just on YouTube, and it's only 3 or 4 days old, and it'll build. So a lot of you are talking, and a lot of you very kindly took the time to listen to arguments that perhaps you don't always accept. A lot of people I know who watch this program very much don't take Harry's side, and I don't always either. But on this issue of Murdoch and the press, it's a little more complicated. And Clive is a real expert, and I think a lot of you enjoyed it, whether you agreed or not. Some of you, though, did point out, before I get into the court case, something I wanted to talk about, which was the role of Vanity Fair, the society's favourite magazine and the kind of source of some of the best gossipy stories about all things royal and showbiz. And they publish Clive, and they've been publishing Clive's rather positive articles about Harry in this crusade of his to make Murdoch and his executives accountable for this era of hacking and other scandals associated with his papers in Britain. And they've printed a lot of those articles. But Vanity Fair's also been printing. Initially, it was quite favourable, I think, to Meghan and Harry. But there was a very devastating article about a week ago, about the same time, actually, that Clive's piece came out by Anna Peel. An absolute stiletto in the ribs of an article, goodness me, all about their, let's be honest, rather disappointing media career in Hollywood and in California, and how, having now played out all the stories of the royal breakup, their ventures, especially Harry's ideas for sort of crazy podcasts, are looking rather lame and embarrassing. That kind of toe-curling story of him suggesting a podcast where he talked to people about why they were psychopaths, including people like Vladimir Putin. Yeah, Harry, that's going to happen. I think Anna Peel rather brilliantly said, this program would be a booking challenge. You bet it would. Yeah, it's a rather sad picture that emerges from that article, actually. Meghan is still active and busy, but she's kind of really just trying to reinvent the sort of homemaking of jam genre. And that looks a little bit kind of like slightly boring and old-fashioned and a bit lame too. Whereas Harry comes across as being slightly detached from it all. And something that we've noticed before when we've talked about the royal visits, the royal-esque visits they've done in recent years, he's much more excited, it seems, by doing the old stuff, the charity stuff, the quasi-royal stuff, rather than the kind of budding media tycoon stuff. Whereas Meghan is still doing that with perhaps less success than she'd hoped. So that's a rather, if you haven't seen it, you should. It's really interesting. It's kind of ouch, really. And one wonders if perhaps their struggles to make money after their various deals with Spotify and Netflix kind of fizzled out. One wonders if that is a factor in this settlement. For those who don't know, Harry, having said numerous times, including very recently, that he would fight this case to the bitter end, he was going to get Murdoch and his executives in court and have them questioned in court of law about what was done and what they knew about what was done and what was covered up, allegedly. Having said he would do it, at the very, very last moment, after apparently 48 hours of non-stop negotiation, he accepted a settlement. And they can both claim a win. Murdoch has avoided the court. And this is now, given his age, I think the last time anybody's ever going to get him anywhere near a court. He can devote his life to hanging out with President Trump and working on his legacy inheritance plan. So I guess he's probably happy. Harry can claim a win. Yeah, and it was a win. Clive Irvin wrote an article, actually, an instant article, also in Vanity Fair yesterday, where he said, basically, this has been a long game of chicken, it seems. I think Clive's a bit surprised too. A long game of chicken. And in the end, Murdoch has caved and has opened his wallet and has issued a big apology, unprecedented apology, which for the first time in public accepts that the Sun newspaper, as well as the News of the World, was involved in this stuff. And it also names Diana and apologizes to her, which is new and big. And Clive reckons, and others reckon, that when you add this to all the other settlements that have been made and the legal costs that Murdoch's had to pick up, it's over $1 billion, which is a lot of money, even to Murdoch. But of course, maybe worth it to keep his business going, because maybe the consequences of a court case were really that bad. Anyway, he's got off the hook legally. Harry's got a big paycheck, and he can claim that he's pushed them further than anybody else has in terms of apologies. But it's interesting when you really read the small print, there's no admission of executive guilt at the Sun, which I think was the real price for Harry. What they say is at the Sun, yes, there was hacking, bad behaviour by the private detectives that the Sun hired. That's as far as they're going. Harry's lawyer was on the court steps saying, well, we're handing our stuff to the police. Maybe there's a criminal inquiry. But you know what? I don't think there will be. I think this is now the end of it all. That whole kind of shabby, angry era that started with, intercepting voicemails and other forms of getting information, becoming normalized in Fleet Street, turning on celebrities, actors, especially royalty, some politicians, and then the massive fallout, the inquiries, the court cases. I think that now will start to recede. But the damage done, hey? The damage done. William, Harry, it's a big part of it. I mean, I know there are other things, relationships breaking down, arguments, but I think the different attitudes to the press, certainly if you're sympathetic to Harry in any way, the different attitudes of William and Harry to the press, it's a big part in there falling out, I think. There's a great story in Spare about Charles having a conversation with Harry about why he wants to press on. Because don't forget, the Windsors, the mainstream Windsors, William himself, issued some very strong statements, got an apology, there was a settlement. But Harry wanted more. Harry said he wanted more. He wanted to really nail down who'd done what and why and when. And his dad and his brother were like, no, leave it, let it drop. And apparently Charles at one point said, Harry, you're on a suicide mission. Which is a sort of interesting phrase. But of course, Harry, he probably didn't say it to his face, but would have thought that one of the big things, I've talked about this a lot, underlying all this is that Charles himself, through his own closest aides, at the absolute high point of this hacking scandal, was in with these papers. And that's something that a lot of people have found hard to accept, even after all these years. And it was very interesting to me that who rushed out with a statement of support for Harry really, really quickly? Spencer. Yeah, Harry's uncle, Charlie Earl Spencer. Very strong, and said how Diana would be proud of him. And I wonder what William thought of that. I mean, that just shows how those two families are still at daggers, I think. I mean, that was a pretty tough statement. Diana would be proud of doing something that William thought he shouldn't do. Yeah, that shows how split they are. But, I don't know, these aristocrats, they let you down. One can take sides of their various disputes. None of them have clean hands. And Earl Spencer, he's also in the news at the moment. Talking of scandals, his long-suffering, soon-to-be ex-wife, who's been dumped. I think she was dumped last year. Karen Gordon, played speaking Canadian. She's been on the attack, saying how he kind of unceremoniously shifted her out in favour of the new one, the new woman in his life. And it just reminded me of something quite funny that I saved a long time ago on Facebook. 2011. I think it would have been William and Kate's wedding. I think it would have been that. And there was a big royal event anyway. And one of the royal commentators, with wonderful sort of acidity, said, and I wrote it down at the time, it was so wonderful, because this would have been about Karen Gordon. This would have been the beginning of their marriage slash relationship, well, marriage. And this commentator said, as the people arrived in their nice hats and their fascinators at the church, "Oh, there's Earl Spencer with his quite new fiancée. They're always quite new, aren't they? But I'm sure he'll be very happy with this one." We love this aristocratic bitching. Yeah, well, anyway, she had a good run, 11, 12 years, and then she was given the old heave-ho. So yeah, Charlie, who's right, who's wrong? It's difficult. Many people thought that he didn't treat Diana particularly well, even though he made the big speech, which was very moving at the funeral. No clean hands in all this, just a big, fat mess and lots of divisions. So that's my first reaction to all of this. Slight surprise, I have to say, and maybe slight disappointment. Maybe I've invested too much of my own ideas about this case in Harry's crusade, which turned out not to be a crusade, but a game of chicken, to quote Clive Irwin, as one always should. So maybe that's why I'm feeling a little bit let down. I wanted the court case. I love the drama, but I wanted to find this stuff out. It was a big part of this country's culture and life, and the power of those papers and the way they behaved. And now I think we will never know what really happened. Probably. I don't think it's going to get... There's nobody left who can take it that far. And it'll just be put into the memory hole, which slightly disappoints me. But anyway, yeah, I mentioned the comments. I always like to read a few out. People people really appreciate it, even if they didn't love it. The conversation with Clive. Phyllis Paras. Thanks, Phyllis. I enjoyed hearing a more balanced perspective on Harry's legal showdown re Murdoch. Thank you very much. Donna Jarvis, 9542. Doesn't really agree. I don't see Harry as an honourable person who ever does things for honourable reasons. Well, look, I know a lot of you agree with that. And he's done some pretty awful things in his time and said some awful things about his family that weren't fair. I know that. Elaine Patterson, 5310. I think you've been on here before, Elaine. Hello. Thank you for staying with me. Another interesting podcast. And congratulations on hitting 10K. Yay, 10K. I think I'm nearly at another 100 since last week. On Harry, look, I'm not a fan. I think he's jealous of William. He's vindictive. It's all rather alarming. And he's told lies himself. So in my book, he's a bit of a weasel. Okay, point taken. Finally, a comment that I really found very touching. And this is nice because this is what I'm trying to do. Toronto 4640. I'm guessing another of our Canadian friends. Thank you, Phil, for presenting this perspective on Harry's pursuit of justice in a well-balanced program, a counterpoint to the constant negativity we always see about Harry. I don't always respect the way he behaves, but I do see this court case as a different issue, or so did I. Anyway, we move on. And we move back in time to an era when if you fell out of favour as a royal and people decided that you were a weasel and you lost the support of the masses, things could happen to you that were rather worse than having your Spotify contract terminated. Your life could be terminated, which is a rather kind of gear change way of moving the conversation to Marie-Antoinette, and why not? Carolyn Harris, big success when she was on the podcast only about 2 months ago. Another of our Canadian friends. It's Canada Week today. Well, I had my maple syrup for breakfast, so that's good. Yeah, Caroline is going to join us in a second. She's a really, really top writer and expert on, well, lots of things to do with royalty, actually, but the historical importance of the royal consorts, people who marry into royal families, is her special field of interest. And nobody, perhaps, has been more significant in that than Marie-Antoinette, who, of course, marries into the French royal family. She has quite a long time as the queen, and she's actually, as you'll discover, quite popular at first. But as you no doubt already know, she marries into this family in the final decades of that family's time running France. At least they do come back, as you know, for a brief second act. But the big revolution's coming, and she's going to lose her head. How did it happen? Did she deserve it? Let's go to Caroline, and I'll see you all at the end with news of the next shows. Thanks so much for watching. Bye. Welcome back, Carolyn. I've been looking forward to this so much. I was going to start by saying, were you as upset as I was by the Olympic opening ceremony when they made a joke of the decapitated queen?
Well, Marie Antoinette has taken on a life of her own, completely independent of her actual life, that she's become a sort of pop culture icon and touchstone. We look at Marie Antoinette in various film versions of her life over the years. The one with Norma Shearer that focuses on her being a frustrated wife trying to fulfill her mother's wishes and then falling into a romance with Swedish diplomat Axel Fersen. And then later in the 21st century, the film with Kirsten Dunst, where she's a teenage girl who just wants to go shopping and to try to make sense of the strange world of Versailles. There's a later film with Diane Kruger, Farewell, My Queen, that almost seems like a revolutionary pamphlet coming to life, imagining that some of these scandals actually happened. And then in the midst of that, we have Marie Antoinette just being used as a shorthand for anyone who's out of touch or is spending to an excessive degree, especially if they are a woman in power or the wife of someone in power. As you think of former Philippine First Lady Imelda Marcos and her shoe collection, how she was compared with Marie Antoinette. And nowadays, there's all sorts of kitschy merchandise depicting Marie Antoinette, even cookies that look like, heads on pikes that pop up every so often. And as a result, people have this stock idea of Marie Antoinette, even if they don't actually know anything about her life and times. They imagine a giant wig, a big skirt, a sort of frivolous life, and then a grisly execution.
Oh
And
no,
there's a
it
lot
does
more
have
to,
everything, and I suppose to be fair to the people that arranged the Olympic ceremony, they weren't really
yeah,
making a joke. It was more a kind of like a sort of a thrilling shock, isn't it? I mean, a bit like when people go to the London Dungeon or Madame Tussauds. It's become part of that
yes,
sort of
yes.
grand
If you go
guignol.
to Madame Tussauds in London, I believe they have what is reputed to be a piece of the guillotine that was the blade that was used to execute Marie Antoinette. And Madame Tussauds was one of Marie Antoinette's contemporaries. She had
Of
her
course.
original wax museum in Paris, and then she was one of the many emigres who had to flee to Britain after the French Revolution, rather like many people who in some way were associated with the French court or had received some kind of royal patronage. In Madame Tussauds' case, she would have had wax images of the royal family while they were in power, and then would have had to change her image very quickly and then flee to Britain. So it's interesting to see, we look at Marie Antoinette's wider times, that we have this very interesting, multifaceted queen who's been reduced to a bit of a caricature or a figure for shock value in popular culture. And then we have her contemporaries, female artists like her portrait artist Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, who she was a patron of, the artists, the courtiers, the Enlightenment philosophers. And there's so much going on at this time. One of the reasons Marie Antoinette courts so much controversy at the French court and beyond is this is a time when there's changing ideas about women's role in society. There's changing ideas about diplomatic relationships and what they should look like. Marie Antoinette's Austrian heritage becomes very significant to how she's perceived. And there's changing ideas of knowledge as well, that we look at Marie Antoinette's lifetime and she loses older sisters to smallpox, and then she persuades her husband, Louis XVI, once he comes to the throne, for he and his brothers to undergo variolation, which was quite dangerous at the
This
time.
was the first attempt to vaccinate people against smallpox, wasn't it?
Vaccination comes a
Yeah.
little bit later with
Oh,
Edward
okay.
Jenner in 1796, with the cowpox being used to vaccinate, as vaccinate comes from vache, the French word for cow. Before that, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, during her time in the Ottoman Empire, in I believe 1721, when her husband was ambassador, had discovered that there was a system of inoculation, of rubbing sort of dried smallpox scabs on the skin to induce a skin infection. And that was much less dangerous than catching smallpox through your respiratory system. There was only a 1 to 2% fatality level for inoculation, whereas it was 30% 100% if you caught smallpox in the
Golly.
usual way.
All
And
right. Well,
one,
let's go back to the beginning.
yeah,
So we could talk all day. I'm sure we will.
yes, we can talk all day. So there's more to Marie Antoinette than some of the scandals. There's also her being in that nexus of enlightenment and new discoveries and all these things that were
Well,
happening.
I once did a program. It was a very thin and shallow analysis of Marie Antoinette and indeed the end of the French royal family. But I did get to interview, or my team did, Antonia Fraser, who wrote a rather
Oh, wonderful.
well-received book about 20 years ago,
Yes, it's a
and
very good book, The Journey.
she was one of the people I think who first started to push back at the kind of classic idea of her as a pampered aristocrat, and saw her as a young woman, a very young, when she gets involved with this man, when she meets him on a Monday, marries him on a Wednesday,
Pretty
how
much.
she was basically a pawn in dynastic maneuvering. So, was that kind of what she was born to do and bred to do, to be sort of somebody else's plaything, at least initially in her life?
Well, the motto of the Habsburg family that she was born into, and then she marries into the French royal family. The Habsburgs, their motto was that others make war, whereas we get married. The Habsburgs had expanded their empire through some very strategic dynastic marriages. Where Marie Antoinette's life took an unexpected turn was just how prestigious her dynastic marriage was. Marie Antoinette, who's born the Archduchess Marie-Antoinette in the Habsburg Empire in 1755. She was the 15th of the 16 children of the
Oh,
Empress Maria Theresa and Francis of Lorraine. So during her early childhood, it seemed as though she'd make a dynastic marriage, but nobody thought it would be a very important one. It would be some minor prince on the borders of the Habsburg Empire. And so during her early years, her education didn't really seem that important. And she looked back on her childhood very fondly. One of the advantages as a historian we have with Marie Antoinette is Marie Antoinette was very prone to muse about her early years with other people who went on to write memoirs after the revolution. We don't always have that for historical figures, but Marie Antoinette's Lady of the Bedchamber, Madame Campan, who survived the revolution and went on to open a girls' school that educated Napoleon's sister. So she survived into the Bonaparte era, wrote a book on Marie Antoinette where she recalled that Marie Antoinette, as queen, remembered her childhood very fondly, all the skating and the sleigh rides at the Schönbrunn outside Vienna, and that Marie Antoinette had been very close to her father, who she'd lost when she was only 7, and that she regarded her mother with respect and awe, that Maria Theresa was a very impressive woman. She'd come to the Habsburg inheritance through the pragmatic sanction, which allowed female succession, and it had to fight off Frederick the Great, who saw in Prussia, who saw this as an opportunity to pick off the province of Silesia. And so Marie Theresa had to look for different diplomatic alliances. So when Marie Antoinette's just a toddler, we see a diplomatic revolution ensuing where Austria and France, who had long been on opposite sides of every conflict since the 30 Years' War, are on the same side in the 7 Years' War. And so it becomes clear that one of Maria Theresa's daughters is going to marry the future Louis XVI, the grandson of Louis XV, who was on the throne
and
at
does
that
does Marie
time.
Antoinette herself have any say in all of this, or is it just you wait your turn, we'll pick somebody for you, and then you're in the carriage and you're off?
Well, something that caused some family resentments is one of the daughters, Maria Christina, did get some say and was able to marry a minor prince who she loved and was able to go and live in the Austrian Netherlands and stay closer to home. But the younger daughters, Maria Amalia, Maria Carolina, Maria Antonia, who becomes Maria Antoinette, were expected to undertake dynastic marriages. So they were quite close with each other and seemed to have resented their older sister, as this was during a time period when ideas of more companionate marriage were emerging. So Maria Theresa is very focused on her children and their marriages supporting the prosperity of the Habsburg Empire. And meanwhile, when we look at Marie Antoinette, much later she would complain to an Austrian diplomat about Louis XVI that it's sort of like, yes, they got along, but his interests were not her interests. He liked blacksmithing and hunting and eating large meals, and she preferred dancing. And that shows the changes that were happening as previous generations of princesses would just be relieved you were married to someone you got along with, that you wouldn't be thinking, well, my interests aren't quite the same, this isn't quite what I expected. And Maria Theresa, in a letter, writes to Marie Antoinette, horrified that she's expressing her views to a commoner, to a visiting envoy about her marriage, and saying that this is how a royal mistress thinks. That's not how a queen expresses herself. And then later, when Marie Antoinette's children are born and she's wanting to breastfeed them or educate them herself, and Maria Theresa, who had had 16 children, one after another, and handed them to wet nurses, was saying, no, the focus is on your role as queen and having more children. So we see this generational shift. And also, Marie Antoinette's responding to some of the Enlightenment trends at the time. But some of these trends are not considered suitable for a queen, even if ordinary upper class women might be thinking, well, I'd like a more companionate marriage. I'd like more of a role in my children's upbringing. For Marie Antoinette, her children are the children of France. And so it's expected that she, a foreign princess, isn't going to be the decisive factor in their upbringing. And so Marie Antoinette had very much had her own views about how she wanted to live her life, and then is up against this dynastic system and up against the traditions expected of a queen, even if there were other ideas in the wider upper class that were changing about domesticity and family life.
When she first meets him, because I think I'm right, aren't they? They literally have 48 hours to meet
Yes,
and
in
then
1770,
marry.
she's 14 and he's 16.
So they're both very young.
They're
They're
both
both
very young.
probably not particularly excited at the prospect, but they know they have to do
No.
it. What does she think of him? Does she think he's a reasonable catch, or is she a bit anxious about the marriage at first?
Well, it seems she was anxious about this role. She was an Austrian archduchess, and remember, Austria is the traditional enemy of France, who is traveling to Versailles to be married. There's that famous scene that you see in many of the film versions where her Austrian clothing and even her dog are taken away, and she's dressed in French clothing. And she found that overwhelming that she goes up to one of her new ladies in waiting, the Countess de Noailles and Arpajon, who would also be guillotined during the French Revolution, and impulsively throws her arms around this woman. And the Countess de Noailles is there to teach the young Dauphine etiquette. So, like, that's not how she's supposed to behave. We get a sense of a 14-year-old who's just overwhelmed. Everything that she's used to is being taken away. And then she's traveling across France. She travels because of this wedding journey more than Louis XVI does. And sometimes in Alsace and Lorraine, there are people who are trying to make her feel at home by speaking German. And she's like, oh, no, no, only speak French to me. I am I am French now. And she worries about the decor for her bedroom. She'd always be very concerned about fashion and decoration, outward appearances, that there was a Habsburg coat of arms. And, she wants something more neutral, because all of the poems that are being read aloud are about France and Austria getting married rather than about her and the future Louis XVI getting married. So just the weight of this diplomatic alliance, I think that is very much there. And then she meets and marries the future Louis XVI. As I say, his grandfather is still the king at this time, Louis XV. And she's thrust into this very overwhelming environment at the French court. Louis XV is a widower, and he lives with his mistress, Madame du Barry, who will also be guillotined during the French Revolution, who was who had began her life as a washerwoman and was a more lower class figure. And at first, the young Marie Antoinette is just asking, who is she? Why is she here? And being told, oh, she's here to amuse the king. And so the young Marie Antoinette, who'd grown up in this very respectable environment where her mother, Maria Theresa, very much projected this image of being a respectable wife and mother, is suddenly at this very dissolute court. And also the early years of her marriage to Louis XVI, the marriage isn't immediately consummated. There's been a lot of speculation about why that was. Stephen Zweig, who was writing in the 1930s, speculated that the future Louis XVI needed to have an operation so that he could perform, that it was uncomfortable for him until that time. And then there have been other speculations that perhaps there was just a lot of teenage awkwardness, that everything was unfolding in public, visiting each other's rooms, and perhaps they'd rather not in front of the whole French court to be known that they're coming and going from each other's rooms. But another issue may simply have been that Louis XVI, the future Louis XVI, would have been surrounded by people hostile to the Franco-Austrian alliance, and perhaps he was being encouraged to keep his options open. So Marie-Antoinette is being bombarded with letters from her mother demanding to know, are you expecting a child? Are you expecting a child? That, be more agreeable, caress him, do this, do that. And the young Marie
Wow, the
Antoinette is
pressure.
basically, she's saying,
she's
she's taken up riding. She's come along on some of his hunting trips, and yeah, and so
so. How
it's
long does
just
it take before she finds things start to click in the bedroom and she does get pregnant?
well, there's a visit from her elder brother Joseph II, um, who basically he writes to another one of their brothers, just being shocked that it seems that the marriage hadn't been fully consummated after, about 7 years at that time,
So
and then
gosh.
the marriage is finally consummated fully, and they have a daughter, I believe, in December 1778, who's of course named, Marie Therese
So
after
she's now
Marie
in her early
Antoinette.
20s, I'm guessing.
Yes,
Yeah.
so she has these early teenage years. She's Dauphine for 4 years until the death of Louis XV from smallpox. Another reason why she's encouraging her husband and his brothers to undergo this very dangerous inoculation process. As I say before, Jenner's vaccination, which was safer, had been developed, and she has a lot of time to devote to her public image at court, that we tend to see all of the big hoop dresses and the wigs as being quite frivolous. But even some of the most outlandish wig ornaments actually had political statements behind them. The one with the ships that we often see in caricatures of Marie Antoinette, in fact, was depicting French involvement in the American Revolution, supporting the American colonists against Britain. This was seen as a way that France could undermine Britain's supremacy in the Atlantic by supporting the American
Yeah, we
colonists. So,
often forget actually that Louis XVI pulls off one of the biggest victories
yes,
for the
yes,
French
we have,
against the old enemy, that's the Brits, by
yes.
getting involved with the American Revolution.
Yes, sending over
Um,
Lafayette and
yeah.
French troops, and
So
you visit the United
he's a
States
successful
flag.
man, although apparently, I mean, I'm going back to Simon Sharma's book now, Citizens, which I remember
Yes,
reading a long time ago. He said, one of
yes,
history's better jokes is that the Bourbon monarchs subsidized the democratic revolutionaries in America and therefore
yes,
bankrupt themselves,
yes,
leading to a
and
crisis where they all lose their heads.
and of course all of the French who had fought in the American Revolution, of course, they come back with all sorts of ideas about how
Mm,
they'd like
mm.
France to change. And there's major figures from the American Revolution who are present in France. Like Thomas Jefferson was the American ambassador to France. Benjamin Franklin, of course, spent extended periods of time in France as well. So this is quite a cosmopolitan environment that, as Dauphine and then Queen, I mean, Marie Antoinette isn't just receiving American envoys and her brother Joseph II giving her and Louis XVI the facts of life talk, but also, Catherine the Great's son, the future Emperor Paul visits incognito. That there's a very wide range of different figures from different parts of the world who are there at the French court. So we sometimes think of this being a closed environment where everyone's focused on fashion and dancing. And there was plenty of that, but there's also a lot of wider European trends. And sometimes Marie Antoinette gets mocked for instance, spending a lot of time at the Petit Trianon outside Versailles and establishing her own little model farm where she lived as a shepherdess, and would milk the cows. And we now see that as being completely ridiculous. This is one of the most affluent women of her time, living as though she's just an ordinary person. But then you look at Britain at the same time, and George III is being satirized as Farmer George because he's spending so much time at Kew Gardens developing what becomes the Kew Botanical Gardens. And when Catherine the Great's son visits, he doesn't want all the pomp and circumstances that would normally come with the visit of the heir to the Russian Empire. He calls himself the Count of the North, which perhaps isn't the most subtle incognito name for a Russian heir. But there's this whole trend towards rediscovering nature, spending more time in nature among the upper classes in
Oh, I know.
Northern Europe at
Actually, I'm
this time.
remembering more now. I'm remembering more of my
Mhm.
Simon Sharma years because I
Yeah.
remember in Citizens, one of his big points is that we think of the French nobility and the upper classes and the monarchy and the Bourbons as being incredibly ossified and old-fashioned and
Yeah.
reactionary, but actually they were changing almost as
Yes.
fast as any other European nation.
Oh, yes.
And
Louis the
perhaps,
16th.
you know,
Louis the 16th actually learned some English so that he could read the works of Scottish Enlightenment philosophers. He was quite fascinated by the work of David Hume, and of course Benjamin Franklin was also spending time in Edinburgh as he was, spending time in Paris. So all these ideas were spreading. And it's actually one of the ideas Maria Theresa has as to how her daughter and her son-in-law could come closer together, that perhaps Marie-Antoinette could read some of these Scottish Enlightenment works, and that is how Marie-Antoinette comes to have her reader, Madame Campan, the daughter-in-law of the court librarian, who reads aloud these kinds of books. And it's interesting that there's archival documents that show the kinds of books that Marie-Antoinette had read to her at various times. And once again, we think of her as very frivolous, and certainly she wasn't reading the heaviest philosophical tomes, but she was very interested in theater, in novels, and also in books about women in power. Perhaps she was trying to make sense of her own situation. So Louise de Carvalho's multi-volume biography of Elizabeth I, that Marie Antoinette seems to have subscribed to that and found it quite interesting. So I think sometimes we just associate her with frivolity, but the public image she was trying to put forward, that she was definitely trying to at first uphold the prestige of the French monarchy. And then later in the 1780s, once she's feeling more secure in her role, her children begin to arrive. She has two sons and two daughters. A daughter and a son are alive at the time of the Revolution. That she begins to adopt these kind of Jean-Jacques Rousseau ideas of living a more natural life. So we see the Vigée Lebrun portraits are transformed from the 1770s. There is Marie Antoinette dressed very formally with the French crown in the background. And then in the 1780s, she's wearing these very simple muslin dresses and straw hats, and she's going through that shepherdess phase. And nowadays, we'd say maybe royalty, they're just like us. But at the time, it was considered very scandalous for a queen to dress like that. A simple muslin dress looked like a petticoat. It looked
well,
like
it's
she was
funny
in her
because,
underwear.
as we know,
Yep.
later she becomes very unpopular, and all people spread all these
Yes.
rumors, and there are these pamphlets and these
Yes.
satirical cartoons, and they're all a lot of them are very explicit, and I'm sure they're all horribly
Yes.
exaggerated and wrong.
Mhm.
But she wasn't hated at the beginning, was she? She was quite popular, in fact.
Well, she's a popular figure at the beginning because she and Louis XVI seem to show a rebirth for the French monarchy. Louis XVI's grandfather, Louis XV, had become extremely unpopular. Louis XV, of course, had had a disastrous defeat during the Seven Years' Wars. With the Treaty of Paris in 1763, he'd had to sign away Canada to the British, something that he didn't think was a very big deal. And even the philosopher Voltaire dismissed Canada as a few acres of snow, which as a Canadian, that's pretty bleak. But at the time, Louis XV had the view that the Sugar Islands in Guadeloupe and Martinique and Saint Domingue, what is now Haiti, were more important than the fur trade in Canada. So Britain gets control over Canada, and then the American colonists think, why are we paying all these taxes if there's no longer a French threat immediately to the north? So the developments will eventually come with the American Revolution. But Louis XV had made himself unpopular because he was viewed as being, as well as losing a lot of French territory overseas, he was seen as being managed by his mistresses, Madame de Pompadour, later Madame du Barry. And Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette present themselves as a very respectable young couple. Even before their marriage is fully consummated, they would go for walks arm in arm in the palace park, demonstrating that they are respectable. They are not like his grandfather. But the flip side to this, because Louis XVI doesn't have any mistresses that we know about, of course, there's always some speculation about what goes on behind the scenes. Because he doesn't have any known mistresses, Marie Antoinette gets the popular scrutiny that a queen would receive and that a royal mistress would receive. It's all directed
Interesting.
at the same person. Whereas Louis XV's Polish Queen Marie Lashinska was seen as a very devout, very respectable figure. Then the problem was Pompadour and Du Barry. Whereas with Marie Antoinette, everything converges on the same woman who's seen as wife, mistress, foreigner, all of these roles.
So, why does she start to become unpopular, and why do people start printing all these lurid stories about her supposed sexual adventures and debaucheries. I'm sure most of them are not true anyway.
Well, there are many reasons for that. As early as 1775, when she'd only been queen for a year and had been married for 5 years, she writes to her mother that, oh, there's this epidemic of satirical songs at court. I am supposed to have lovers, male and female. This is all ridiculous. That she writes home as if, like, oh, maybe it does bother her more than she's letting on. She's just playing it down to her mother as if it's just a silly thing that's happening at court that spreads more widely. I think the unpopularity of the Franco-Austrian alliance didn't help. There were many people who wanted to undermine that marriage. And also this environment at the French court where Louis and Marie-Antoinette don't have a child together for such a long period of time. That leads to a lot of speculation about what else is happening in her life. And gradually, although there's always an affectionate bond between Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, they're living more separate lives. He is hunting and blacksmithing and reading Scottish Enlightenment philosophy and having large meals. And she spends more time at the Petit Trianon and more time with her friends, the Princess de Lamballe, the Duchess de Polignac, and she defends these people to her mother, saying, Louis enjoys their company as well, and that he, gives me the money to renovate the Petit Trianon, that he doesn't object to this. But the trouble is that there was a very established patronage network at the French court, and Marie Antoinette was circumventing that by just placing people she liked in positions like governess to the children of France, superintendent of the Queen's household, and it was just seen that very young girls without a lot of experience or prestige were suddenly in control of enormous patronage allowances. And so there was a lot of jealousy at court that was going on, a lot of people telling stories because they didn't get the court preferment that they would have expected. And so a lot of these very ugly rumors start spreading. And then in 1785, the next decade, we have the diamond necklace scandal that doesn't directly involve Marie Antoinette, but it ends up undermining her reputation because this is one of those things Louis XVI should have just investigated privately. And instead, there's a big public trial of Cardinal Rohan, who was involved in the procurement of this diamond necklace. He thought, or he said that he thought he was doing this on Marie Antoinette's behalf. Really, he was either being duped or was in collusion with a jewel thief, Jeanne de la Motte Valois, who claimed she was one of those friends of Marie Antoinette's. And so a whole trial happens before the Paris Parlements, the law courts in Paris, of the cardinal, asking, is it reasonable for him to think the Queen's trying to buy a diamond necklace behind her husband's back, that someone like Jeanne de la Motte Valois would be a friend of the Queen, that a forged signature, there's a forger involved in this as well, on these documents would indeed be correct. And at one point, there's sort of a shop girl who's dressed up as the Queen in order to have a late night rendezvous and just hand a rose to the cardinal and say, you know what this means. That through all of this in the trial is it reasonable that the cardinal would have thought the Queen would have behaved like that on all these levels? And trial briefs are published. People follow all of the details, all of the rumors about this extravagant Queen apparently trying to
Mm,
buy the fanciest diamond necklace in the world without her
mm,
husband finding out, and sneaking around at night and consorting with questionable people. And once again, this had all come as a shock to Marie Antoinette. She didn't know this was happening until the jewelers wanted the bill, and she'd never given a commission to Cardinal Rohan. But when the cardinal is acquitted, when the Paris Parlements basically, either because of his wealth and prestige or because they think, well, with all the rumors about Marie Antoinette, no wonder he was duped into being part of this, that once he's acquitted, that undermines Marie Antoinette's reputation even further. And we have another wonderful memoir by her portrait painter, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who was painting these portraits trying to present Marie Antoinette as respectable. There's one in just before the French Revolution, 1787, thereabouts, that shows Marie Antoinette with her three of her four children. The baby Sophie's just passed away, so there's an empty cradle, and the public's being invited to sympathize with the queen, who has Marie Therese standing by her side, the heir Louis Joseph in front of her, little Louis Charles in her lap, and then this empty cradle. And basically, Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, like many artists, of course, wanted to hear what people were saying about the painting. She goes to the Paris Salon, and people are pointing and laughing and saying it's Madame Deficit, who's responsible
Mhm.
for all these financial problems. And as we discussed, the American Revolution is much more expensive than Marie-Antoinette's acquisition of new properties or the dresses she was buying. That France had a big debt problem before Louis XVI came to the throne, and then we have France's involvement in various overseas endeavors, such as the American Revolutions. There's a lot more going on than Marie
So, yeah.
Antoinette, but she becomes a very convenient scapegoat for all of France's problems going into the 1780s.
Yeah, and she becomes very, the subject of all these rumors. But go back to the Antonia Fraser interview, I remember.
Yes,
She thinks that she probably did have one affair. She didn't
yes,
have numerous flings with
yes.
half of the stable boys of Versailles, which is what she was accused of in these very lurid stories. But she probably did fall in love with somebody. Do you think that's right?
Well, I believe she definitely fell in love with someone, Axel Fersen, a Swedish diplomat, and she clearly loved and trusted him, and she involved him. And we're moving a little bit ahead in the story, but the attempt that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and their children make to escape a couple of years after the French Revolution, the flight to Varennes, Axel Fersen is key to organizing that. And
Mm.
he, in fact, is driving the carriage at one point. Perhaps the attempt might have succeeded if he'd stayed at the reins. And he's mentioned at her trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal, you involved a foreigner in this attempt to escape, this Swede who was involved in that. And then the trial moves on, and you think, are they, she's being accused of everything else. Are they going to dwell on clearly how trusted this man was? But instead, the trial just moves ahead with treason, and she's accused of all sorts of other things as well. And Axel Fersen, they sort of breeze on past his role in the flight to Varennes. So it's very clear she loved him, she trusted him, that there were letters between them. His family destroyed his papers, so there's a lot of missing pieces there. Whether and when this relationship was consummated is a matter of some debate. I believe there's a book by Evelyn Farr where she argues, oh, it was consummated earlier, and maybe he's the father of her two younger children. Most historians think if it was consummated, it happened later, after the revolution, when she's living in the Tuileries in
All right. Well, I
Paris,
shouldn't. I
and it
was.
would have happened later. So
I shouldn't have
definitely
jumped
she
ahead. I'm
loved him.
sorry. I
Yeah.
didn't mean to jump ahead to the revolution. I don't want to get there
Yeah,
just yet.
definitely she loved him. Whether and when it was physically consummated is a matter of such debate
So
through to the
going
present
into the
day.
build up to the revolution,
Yes.
a lot of people blame Louis. This
Hmm.
could have been stopped. There didn't have to be a revolution,
Hmm.
but he was very stubborn and he made all sorts of bad decisions. Was Marie Antoinette really closely involved with the way he was governing France at this time? Did she have a role in these supposedly bad decisions, or is she just out on the farm playing it, being a shepherdess?
Well, it seems early in her marriage, she didn't have so much of a role. There's a lot of frustration in Austria that when her children begin to arrive, basically her mother and then her brother Joseph II see this as an opportunity for her to wield influence on behalf of Austria. And initially, Louis XVI makes sure that's not happening, that he really tries to keep his wife out of the political arena. But later in the 1780s, Louis XVI becomes increasingly overwhelmed. There are these financial problems. There's an antiquated taxation system, as France is divided into three estates. The first estate's the clergy, the second estate's the nobility, the third estate is everyone else. And of course, at one point, everyone else meant mostly the peasantry, but now there's a wealthy bourgeoisie in the cities who want to have more influence, and they resent they're having to pay a lot of taxes. And at one point, once again in the medieval period, it might have made sense for the nobility not to have to pay as many taxes because they were doing the fighting and defending the frontiers. But now that the nobility is concentrated at Versailles, jockeying for power rather than maintaining private armies off on France's borders, all of this is completely antiquated antiquated. The debt had spiraled out of control by this time. And so the whole taxation system needed to be revamped. Various finance ministers are brought in and removed. But there's a lot of vested interest. Like certainly Louis XVI didn't necessarily have the imagination to think outside the box to the degree that perhaps he should have. But there were a lot of vested interests who didn't really want to give up their tax benefits, who didn't want to see society shifting in a dramatic fashion, who perhaps underestimated how much discontent there was in the cities. And also, there was a series of bad harvests right there in the late 1780s. Sort of climate change has an effect as well, in that the price of bread goes up. So that leads to even more discontent. So certainly Louis XVI is a factor. But where Marie Antoinette gets more influential is as we get closer to the revolution. Louis XVI seems to have fallen into what we might think of as clinical depression. He becomes increasingly inward looking, increasingly passive. And Marie Antoinette becomes, and John Hardman's written about this, becomes a more and more politically active figure, corresponding with French ministers herself, that she seems to have thought she needed to take charge in order to protect her son's inheritance because her husband was just increasingly becoming overwhelmed. And so we see what happens in 1789. Louis XVI calls the estates general, the representatives of the first, second, and third estates, in order to address the financial issues. And instead, he's facing calls for the way the taxation system works to be completely revamped and for the French monarchy itself to change. There's calls for an English style constitutional monarchy. And Louis XVI, unless there's a tax on the church, he was quite pious. Otherwise, he's inclined to passively go along with this as the States General becomes a national assembly and the Third Estate swearing the tennis court oath not to be disbanded, until, they have their rights. As all of these events are unfolding, Louis XVI becomes rather passive, and it's Marie Antoinette who's very much trying to correspond to figures, like Lafayette or Mirabeau, and to try to maintain some degree of power for her husband. And she seems to have been very concerned about her son and his eventual inheritance. This only makes Marie Antoinette more unpopular, as there's a lot of anxiety in French history about women in power. There had been some queen regents who've been very unpopular. Catherine de' Medici is an example, who had been regent for her son, Charles IX, at the time of the St. Bartholomew's Eve massacre. And in fact, they are directly compared in pamphlets at the time and at Marie Antoinette's trial. So the more active Marie Antoinette's perceived as being, the more unpopular she becomes. And there's widespread rumors of all the influences on Louis XVI out at Versailles. And so we get the March on Versailles in October in 1789, where the women and perhaps a few men dressed as women march on Versailles. Marie Antoinette very narrowly escapes being murdered in the midst of this. They burst into her bedroom, and luckily there's a secret passage that she can get to Louis XVI's rooms, and she joins her husband. But the king and queen and their children and their courtiers are dragged to Paris with the chance of, we're bringing the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy, because, the bread shortages are key to this urban discontent. And they are set up in the Tuileries Palace, where they can be very carefully watched. And it's assumed that some kind of a constitutional monarchy will develop. This is the period where we see British romantics looking at the French Revolution and thinking, wow, the Declaration of the Rights of Man's being published. It's a whole new day. All sorts of extraordinary things are going to happen. And Louis XVI, as I say, unless the church is being attacked, he's more or less willing to just passively.
We do forget, don't we, that the revolution and the terror. I mean, the revolution was violent enough, but they're not the same thing. There's two or 3 years pass before the real headbangers and maniacs indulge in this orgy of kind of political murder, including Marie Antoinette. So in those 2 or 3 years, they're kind of like prisoners of the new regime, aren't they? Trying to negotiate their futures.
Yeah, negotiating their future, but of course, the ostensible public image is that they are king and queen. There's a new and that they have independence, even though they really don't. They do get to travel a little bit to their country palaces, but they're always being carefully watched. There's a lot of concern about, and rightly concern over who Marie Antoinette's corresponding with. Is certainly, we now have a better sense that she was in touch with, with the Austrian Habsburgs, the royalty in Spain, that she was
And the
connected with
worry is
other
that they're
royal
going to come in
houses.
and crush the revolution, which of course is what the next
Well,
20 or
she
30 years is
wants
about.
Louis XVI in the role that he had been in before. She very much sees that them being forced to wear these sort of red, white, and blue cockades, and being sort of trotted out as figureheads for this ongoing revolution. That is not something that she supports. And once again, Louis XVI, he's understandably depressed. They lose their older son Louis Joseph in 1789 to tuberculosis, and that almost receives no attention at all. There's so much else going on. So they have two children by this time, Marie Therese and Louis Charles, the Duke of Normandy, who becomes the Dauphin after the death of his older brothers. They're in this very precarious situation where a new constitution is being developed as a constitutional monarchy. And ultimately, once again, Marie Antoinette, leaning on her friend, who was perhaps more than a friend, Axel Fersen, arranges for the flight to Varennes, where they flee to the borders of the Habsburg Empire. If they had made it out of France, there may well have been more revolutionary violence that came out of that, or some kind of an Austrian invasion with Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette involved. There would be the French Revolutionary Wars without them. But if this had succeeded, that would have changed the geopolitics to some degree. And it's a very precarious escape in that Marie Antoinette doesn't want to arrive as a fugitive. So Timothy Tackett's written a really dramatic book, When the King Took Flight, about how the children's governess, Madame de Tourzel, who'd replaced the Duchess de Polignac, disguised herself as a Russian noblewoman with the two royal children as her children, Marie Antoinette as their governess, Louis XVI as the steward, Louis XVI's sister Elizabeth as the maid. But it's in a big, showy carriage. And so that attracts attention. There's clearly aristocrats escaping, even if it's not the royal family. This looks very questionable. And then, of course, it's hard to flee when your image is on the coinage, and reputedly that is how Louis XVI is recognized. They make it to the small town of Varennes, where in many ways they're undone by how public the Versailles court was. Anyone who was appropriately dressed during Louis XVI's reign could come in and see the royal family having dinner, and there were stalls that rented the proper sword and jacket for men and the gown for women. So poorer people, like not completely poor people, but poor people could get in there. So in Varennes, there was one person who had
Oh,
made this trip, and he's
oh,
brought
that's
in
so.
by the
I never
mayor.
knew that.
Yeah,
That is tragic in a way. I
yeah,
mean,
this
gosh,
person who had been to Versailles is brought in by the mayor to
you're
see
the
Louis
king. I know you.
XVI.
Oh,
And then immediately drops to his knees, and so that becomes the hint, like he knows that this is the royal family. And of course Louis XVI tries to persuade the town to let him go, but instead the authorities in Paris are contacted. The royal family is brought back to Paris, and there's some figures in the National Assembly who just want to pretend this never happened, or pretend he was kidnapped. They're already working on a constitution. They want to pretend this didn't happen. But there are others who think, no, the monarchy has to go. So we see Louis XVI is deposed, the family is imprisoned, and he is put on trial and executed. And then Marie Antoinette is separated from her son, and then she too is placed on trial and guillotined. So the terror comes later, after Louis XVI's overthrow, the failure of the flight to Varennes, and also the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars, with the overthrow of the French monarchy, the execution of Louis XVI. The other major powers in Europe invade France. And so Marie Antoinette, when she's finally placed on trial, the formal charges are colluding with the Austrians
hmm.
for this invasion. And at the time, the
That seems
revolutionary
very unfair, but maybe inevitable. I mean, could she really? Did she actually have a chance? I mean, from the moment she's taken, is her fate sealed? Do you think?
Well, when she's put on trial, by modern standards, the evidence isn't there. Now, historians do have more evidence of who she was corresponding with when, but the French revolutionaries are just assuming they don't have smoking gun evidence. So, as a result, they basically go through a lot of the material in the pamphlets and just try to destroy her reputation. And that almost backfires. She's accused of abusing her son at one point in order to control him and to serve as his regent. And she appeals to, to all the mothers in the gallery, anyone who is listening to this, how can I respond to such a charge? And some of the women in the gallery start applauding. So the revolutionaries back away from that it's clear she's starting to be a sympathetic figure. Germaine de Stael, the daughter of the finance minister, Jacques Necker, basically says, that there's, two little children on their knees wanting their mother back, that this is terrible. And the conservative writer in Ireland, Edmund Burke, says, the French are always known for their gallantry towards women. Why are they doing this? That perhaps it made sense to put Louis XVI on trial because he had been the king, and he's placed on trial for what he did as constitutional monarch. It's assumed before 1789 he was an absolutist monarch and could do as he liked. But the trial of Marie Antoinette is more controversial because she is the king's consort, and there's a whole debate. Well, what kind of power does a queen consort
No,
have?
you're right. It shocked world opinion, I think. And I think
Yes,
that you mentioned Burke. Burke's
yes,
famous critique of the revolution is one
yes,
of the great statements of conservative thought from a man actually
yes,
who had backed the American Revolution earlier.
yes,
So there's that divide between the good revolution
yes.
and the kind of
There's a big,
lunatic
there's an
orgy
enormous
of
shift
violence.
enormous shift between there being cautious optimism or sometimes all out optimism early in the revolution. Maybe we're going to see the peaceful transition to a constitutional monarchy, to reactions to the terror after the overthrow of the monarchy. And then France becomes a kind of pariah state, and the French Revolutionary Wars ensue. And if anything, this just sort of creates greater paranoia within France. We have the terror and the guillotining of thousands of people. Also, the big uprisings in the Vendée and
Mm.
all of the deaths that happened there. So this very brutal and bloody process ensues, and it consumes the leaders of the terror as well. Eventually, Maximilien Robespierre's associates, he's leading the terror, overthrow him, thinking that he's going to execute the rest of them. And he tries to take his own life and is unsuccessful. And so Robespierre himself is guillotined. So we look at going back to Marie Antoinette's own family, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI's sister, Madame Elizabeth, they are all guillotined. Poor little Louis Charles dies of neglect and abuse and tuberculosis in prison. His older sister would later hear, but you're hearing his cries because they were kept at one point on different floors of the same building, and then the cries were there no more. It's very sad. And Marie Therese, who's a teenager at this time, she's kept in solitary confinement for basically a year, writing on the walls that she's the most miserable girl in the world. And finally, there's a deal with the Austrians during the French Revolutionary Wars that she'll be traded back to her Habsburg relatives in exchange for French prisoners. So she gets sent to the Habsburg court, and she marries her French cousin, one of Louis XVI's brother's sons, the Duc d'Angoulême. They don't have any children, so there are no direct descendants of Marie Antoinette. But Marie Therese is back at the time of the Restoration after
No,
Napoleon with her
it's a
husband.
very sad end, really, to all of them.
It, it's a very sad end that they're very much scapegoated for all these bigger problems
Yes,
that
I'm sure
France is
that's
having
right.
at that time.
I mean, we talk about her execution. I mean, it was obviously witnessed by many thousands of people, and she was
Yes.
attended by the people who wrote about it. She seems to have made at least a very dignified end to her life, insofar as one can.
Yes, it was expected if you were aristocratic that it was a sign of good breeding that you would make a good end. I mentioned Louis XV's mistress, Madame du Barry, who started out life as a washerwoman, and a sign of that, it was seen at the time she was guillotined. She was screaming and yelling, begging for someone to help her, which is a perfectly ordinary human reaction to being escorted to the guillotine. But many people thought, oh, that's a sign that no matter how far Madame du Barry rose as a royal mistress, that's a lower class woman, that she's yelling for someone to get her
Tough,
out of this. Like,
tough people, tough times.
Yeah, spare me, good people. Whereas Marie Antoinette, she didn't even receive a carriage as Louis XVI had. She was put in the back of a cart, and the last portrait of her is a sketch by Jacques Louis David, who would later go on to paint Napoleon. And it's this very determined, severe image. Her hair's been cropped. She's wearing a kind of mob cap and a petticoat, and is in the back of this cart, absolutely resolute and determined, and she was very composed through this whole process of being led to the guillotine in front of jeering crowds. She forgive, forgives the executioner. She apologizes because she accidentally steps on his hand, getting into position there. That her last words seem to have been, I'm sorry, monsieur, I did not mean to. And then she's, placed in the guillotine and beheaded. And the guillotines become so associated with the French Revolution, and it was seen as an aristocratic way to go that previously, poorer people were hung, richer people were beheaded. And so the guillotine was actually seen in a horrific way as democratizing death, that everyone condemned would die in the same way. And the inventor of the guillotine was actually quite horrified it was being used for mass murder. He'd seen it as a more merciful way to be beheaded for those criminals who were, and then it's being used as a kind of assembly
Gosh.
line. So Marie Antoinette meets her end, and then this kind of afterlife happens that in the 19th century, she's either viewed as this let them eat cake figure, where there's no evidence that she said that. If anything, it was probably Louis XIV's queen, the Spanish princess, and Marie Therese, who if anyone said it, it was probably that earlier generation. So she's either viewed as this very negative figure, or with the restoration of the French monarchy under Louis XVI's brother, Louis XVIII, their son was known as Louis XVII, Louis XVIII, after the fall of Napoleon, that there's this romanticization of that period. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette as martyrs. There's a statue of them put up in Saint Denis Cathedral, that they are reburied there. And then we get all these historical novels that treat her as a kind of romantic heroine. So there are these two warring images of Marie Antoinette after her death.
Where do you
There
come
is,
down? Where do you come down? I mean, you're a great scholar of consorts. So, I mean, I don't know where you put her on the list of successful or unsuccessful consorts.
well, I don't think either of these images are very helpful, portraying her as either the cause of all France's problems. That's clearly inaccurate. But I don't think it's accurate to regard her as a kind of romantic heroine who didn't have any control over her fate, that she was very much engaged with the various intellectual currents and cultural currents of the time, and perhaps that no one could have quite navigated the complicated situation she was in, being an Austrian in France, being in this complicated marriage where children don't arrive for an extended period of time, being blamed for basically the bankruptcy of the French state. That she was in this very delicate situation. But I think it's important to look at her as a multifaceted person who was very much engaged with the events of her times, rather than treating her as a kind of symbol. There have
Mm.
been books written about the pamphlet literature, all these obscene pamphlets that just exploded into the popular consciousness after the French Revolution. They circulated more secretly before 1789, but they were everywhere after 1789. And sometimes the real Marie Antoinette gets treated as a kind of symbol or a blank canvas for putting these kinds of images onto, and that it's almost seen as the real Marie Antoinette doesn't matter, and what matters is what people thought of her. And I think it's important to look to the real Marie Antoinette as her experiences, her correspondence, just give a real sense of what was happening at that time, that there was a lot of social changes in the domestic sphere, and it was a very difficult situation to navigate. I think looking back, perhaps the flight to Varennes was probably the biggest miscalculation, as it definitely speeded up that process from revolution into terror. Perhaps Marie Antoinette becoming more politically active and becoming more of a target around the time of the revolution, that was also a miscalculation. But it's difficult to argue a counterfactual, or whether someone else in that role, better educated, shrewder, more reserved, would have been able to navigate the very difficult situation that Marie
Hmm.
Antoinette found
And I
herself
guess
in at a young age.
I guess at the end of the day, it was the Bourbons. They'd run the country for a long time. The estates, the
Mhm.
taxation system, the decision to help the
Mhm.
Americans, all of that was nothing to do with her, although she, in a sense, carried the can for some of it historically.
Yes, that she was stepping into this situation where she's scapegoated for things that are outside of her control. But that being said, we shouldn't treat her as a kind of cipher. That she had very clear ideas of what she hoped to accomplish as queen, and she did not succeed in that. It's also important to remember just how young she is over this period of time. She's in her late 30s when she was guillotined, and she was showing symptoms of what might have been uterine cancer at that time. Her health was very bad during those final months of imprisonment. But she was married at 14, she was queen at 18, she was a mother in her 20s, and all of this is unfolding over a very condensed period of time. When she was still very young, and once again, it's difficult to determine if one of her older sisters had been in this role. She had lost a couple of elder sisters to smallpox, which was one of the reasons she was in this role. Whether any of the other figures within the wider Habsburg family could have navigated this better, we simply do not know. Some of her sisters had quite exciting lives, as in Naples and in Parma, with their own dynastic marriages. But gradually, we're seeing a shift away from, in the 19th century, dynastic marriages, while royalty continues to marry other royalty. After the Congress of Vienna in 1814, dynastic marriages stop being as politically significant. There's a shift, and Marie Antoinette sort of just missed that shift. That in the late 18th century, new ideas of companionate marriage are emerging, and yet princesses and archduchesses are still being moved around like pieces on a chessboard. And so Marie Antoinette had to do her best to navigate the situation that she faced.
Well, that somehow nearly an hour has passed, and we've learnt so much. And I'm so grateful for your remarkable knowledge and depth of knowledge, and for sharing it so vividly with us. And I don't know, you're going to have to come back, because I mean, there's just so many of them on the list.
I'd love to come back. Some of Marie Antoinette's contemporaries. I mean, we've talked about Caroline of Brunswick, but
Mm.
certainly I'm surprised the Scandalmongers podcast has made it this far without a Catherine the Great episode. I feel that 18th century Russia, there's a lot of potential there.
I
So
think there might
definitely
be.
we could return to this time period. Marie Antoinette's portrait painter, Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, after the Revolution, goes to the court of Catherine the Great and
Ah.
continues painting there. So we could definitely, follow some of the themes we've been discussing to different
Well, I would
parts of
very
the.
much like that. I'm going to put up some clips from my not very, it's not at the top of my CV. It was a French drama. Okay, it was about 15 years ago. It was beautifully shot in Versailles, which had just been,
Mhm.
they'd just redone the whole of Mirrors. But it is what you might call slightly cheesy, the footage. And I was asked to turn it into a documentary, so I did lots of interviews with people like Antonia Fraser. So
Mhm.
I gave it a little bit of respectability. But of course, what people really wanted to see was the scenes where the headboard is knocking against the wall, and the scene where he's examining for mosquito bites, all this stuff that probably never ever happened, but very lurid. But I think proper historians like your good self bring clarity to the sort of the more scandalous and the more entertaining side. But we probably need both. So yeah, we'll do
I
Russia
think it's
next.
important to see these figures as multidimensional people and not simply the sum of the rumors about them that circulated in their own lifetimes and beyond.
Absolutely agree. Okay, we'll make a date for Russia. And once again, thank you
All
so
right.
much for your time. That was
All
really
right. We'll chat about
entertaining.
Catherine the Great.
We will. Bye. Vive la France. I should burst into a song, shouldn't I? From Les Miserables. Actually, maybe I should spare you that. Thank you for staying with me till the bitter end. If you did, Caroline is just a source of knowledge. I think I could probably just turn off my feed and she could just talk for 2 hours about all these subjects and be absolutely fascinating. I am so lucky to get to talk to people like her. Anyway, I thought I'd have a glass of water. What's this? Oh, look. Scandalmonger's water bottle. One of the many new working up a sweat. Isn't that funny? One of the many wonderful gifts you can get in our gift shop. Well, when I say many, I mean there's mugs and there's water bottles. I think there might be a T-shirt. Yeah, I think we've sold about 2 T-shirts, but quite a few mugs. So they're there, and if you want to support us, have a bit of fun, get yourself a funny mug. Another day, another scandal. You naughty boy, I'm feeling scandalous. That sort of thing. They're in the shop, and there's a link in the bio. And so, yeah, thank you for your support. Please keep liking and subscribing. If you're new around here, always appreciate it if you could subscribe on YouTube, even if you listen on an audio app. Some lovely things coming up next week. Opium, the Opium Wars, and a rather shabby and definitely scandalous story of British history that isn't very well known here. Maybe that's because it doesn't look really, really bad, which is the story of the Opium Wars and when Britain was by far the world's biggest international drugs dealer. Yep, that's how we built the empire, folks. Actually, it wasn't just that, but it's an interesting story. And it's not, Alan Lester knows it very well. He's joining me to talk about it. And it's interesting to me because I think the challenge of British history is something I think about a lot. I'm just finishing a book all about the end of the war and the beginning of the end of the empire and balancing the good and the bad. And there's plenty of good, certainly when you come to talk about the Second World War, balancing that with the more negative stories, which I think have to be told, shouldn't be covered up, is a real challenge to a writer. And so it'll be interesting to talk about opium in that context too. James Crossland, a really good writer, he's joining us the week after to talk about the wonderfully named Sir Robert Hamilton Bruce Lockhart. Should have been this week, Phil. Very Scottish. Burns Night, in honour of my ancestor, my great grandfather, James Craig from Kirkcudbright in southwest Scotland. That's where I got my name, a very Scottish name. And now I have a grandson also called James Craig. Isn't that sweet? Anyway, no, we're not doing it this week. A couple of weeks' time, we'll learn all about him, the rogue agent, wonderful story of intrigue and skullduggery and cloaks and daggers and the Russian Revolution. So that's going to be fun. And a new friend, Natalie Garrett, is going to join us to talk about Queen Charlotte, who was the consort of King George III, the famous Mad King George. Had a really interesting and very, very eventful and significant life. And that's going to be another fun fascination for those of you like me who love British and royal history. I think that's me done for the day. Long show. If you got this far, have a dram of whiskey to celebrate. I'll be having several of those later. I'm now going to go and think about putting the haggis on. Apparently it needs 155 minutes. Did you know that? There you are. Depends on the size of the haggis and the size of the appetites. But I'll give you a full blow-by-blow account of the haggis and our Burns Night evening when I meet you next Sunday for some opium. Oh gosh, I'll get demonetized. Opium not to smoke, to talk about. All right, thanks for everything and your company again today. See you all soon. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.